Hello and welcome to the question and answer session for the Science of Learning online course. I'm delighted to be welcoming back Professor Paul Howard-Jones and Professor Tim Jay to provide their expertise in answering your questions today. So we're going to kick off with a question from Lakshmi. Is there any scientific evidence which shows that learning can change brain structure? Paul.
Oh, yes. There's lots of evidence. Originally, some of the evidence was not in educational context. So the famous one is about the taxi drivers and the fact that the posterior part of their hippocampus, which is a very important region for laying down memory, gets larger with the amount of experience of taxi driving. But happily, we've had more examples lately of similar types of study that have been done in more educational contexts. So there was one about studying for a final medical examination that showed that the brain was expanding during the 3 months revision period. And interestingly, the expansion of those particular parts of the brain to do with revising continued in some regions after the exam. And the researchers pointed to the possibility that the stress of revising for the exam actually inhibited some of the growth that would have taken place, which then, manifested itself after the exam had actually been taken. But I think the best study was what it was done, or the most interesting study perhaps was Martinson 2012, which was a foreign language study. So this was adults that were learning a foreign language in a very intense way over a period of weeks. And they found that there were increases again in the hippocampus, but that those changes in the hippocampus actually predicted memory performance independent of the time spent studying and the vocabulary increase as well. So what you're looking at here is a change in the brain as a result of revising for your foreign language, which is also predictive of your learning ability more generally. So, this is real evidence that you are building your brain, that you have a role in constructing your brain's abilities. So I really love that study.
I would just add, as well as the studies that have looked at specific examples of learning, I think it's really important for us to remember that the brain is changing all of the time. We're always learning to some extent, and the brain's always changing to some extent. And mostly that's on a quite a micro level, if you like. But there's connections are becoming stronger, some are becoming weaker, some new connections are being formed. And that is just happening all the time. Whenever we're learning, whenever we're doing anything or experiencing anything in the world, the brain is changing its structure on a micro level. And there's also evidence that the brain can change if it needs to on a macro level as well. So when the brain suffers an injury of some kind, either through an accident, or we know there's good evidence from when people have experienced a stroke, say that's damaged part of the brain. Other parts of the brain can pick up those functions that were lost because a part of the brain is damaged. So we know it's always happening at some level. And if it needs to, the brain can change its structure on quite a macro level too.
It really is quite an amazing thing, isn't it? The brain, and which sort of understands why we just still don't know fully how it works because of that. And it is a fantastic area to be studying. Thanks for that. Melissa has asked, how can we design a system of rewards for teenagers and adults to improve engagement, considering that by age many don't take compliments well, and they think they're not honest and they get too shy. We've talked about this actually when we were planning the course. I remember this discussion, and yes, it's a really interesting point.
This is an interesting question. So I don't think that I've got any research on this, but I have got some experience because we ran this big study looking at the effects of uncertain reward, using uncertain rewards in science lessons. And by that, what I mean is not giving 2 points when you've got a question correct, but not giving 1 point when you've got a question correct, but either giving 2 points or no points, depending on the spin of a wheel of fortune. So you still have to learn because you have to win the opportunity. But then whether how many rewards you get, how many points you get, actually depends on some element of chance. And what we found was that this was received very well, particularly by teenagers, actually. When you start mixing up luck and learning in order to win points, it becomes much more like a game. And that seems to make it much more cool. So, teenagers were really celebrating the fact that they were accumulating points. And I think you have to be careful with this, because what I'm talking about in terms of uncertainty, it's not the teacher being just random in their allocation of points. It has to be seen to be part of some, impregnably unbiased machine, like a wheel of fortune, or tossing a coin or something like that. But that seems to make the winning of rewards more cool. And I think it's possibly because you can actually win points largely by luck. You can win the game by luck, but you still has to be some learning there as well. So I would try that one, uncertain rewards.
I know there's some teachers in my son's school that do that, and when they want to give a reward for someone in the class, instead of just giving a fixed reward, they let them pick something out of a bag, and they're not allowed to look. And it might be that they get to leave the class first, or it might be they get one of the school reward points, or it might be something else. But it means they don't know what they're going to get, and that does seem to be more attractive than just a fixed reward. Just anecdotally, I think part of the reason why that might work well is that it avoids rewards becoming too competitive and there always being the same winners and losers. Because I think with some reward systems, if it's too linear a reward structure, one person's reward can easily be seen by another as their penalty, because there's always, if it's a linear reward schedule, there's always some winners and losers, and they tend to be the same winners and losers, and then that can create its own problems. But going back to a specific example in that question, I would be careful about underestimating the value of a compliment or verbal praise for teenagers and adults. And even though you might see some embarrassment on the surface, I think you'd find actually they're more welcome than you think. And a way to help deal with that embarrassment initially is that to make verbal rewards and praise just more common in the classroom, because the more you're doing this on a regular basis and giving all the students in the class opportunities to do well and be rewarded for that, the less likely it's going to be experienced as embarrassing, and the more likely then the real value of the reward can be expressed by learners. So I wouldn't give up on verbal rewards altogether.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's very true. I think one of the things is that you probably just have to be careful about using praise and be sometimes, in some instances, more discreet about that, I think.
Absolutely. We've got, building on that suggestion there, that our Managing Behaviour for Learning course, we focus actually quite a lot on how you can use praise and reward and how that could be delivered for particular types of students as well. So I would recommend actually having a look at I think the third week of that course goes into a bit more detail about different classroom-based activities where you can still create a culture in the classroom that is accepting of praise. Our next question comes from Dawn, who is asking what strategies might help promote engagement when children are returning to the school environment after lockdown.
I think to a large extent, there's going to be some work to do in finding out how children have experienced lockdown, because they might be coming back to school with quite different needs. I think all children will have had a long period of time without seeing many other children. And so there may need to be those opportunities for social interaction that might need to be built in before children are able to really concentrate on the learning. They may need to get some of these things out of the way. It might be a need just to talk and play with other children. It might be a need to just talk about their experiences of lockdown. And that might tie in with a need to help children get back into a positive learning routine. So it might be that coming back from lockdown, a really well-established routine in the classroom might be even more important. So children know what to expect and when they really need to get their heads in gear and start concentrating on what the teacher's saying. So that routine can build in those opportunities to fill in the gaps that children have been missing out on. So the routine can have some opportunities for social interaction, give children the opportunity to talk to each other and talk about their experiences during lockdown, but also work toward that point where children know, okay, that part's over, now we're really concentrating on the learning content. So I think really thinking about how to develop that routine for children to support whatever needs they have post-lockdown and to support learning might be even more important than usual.
Yes, I mean, again, I would agree with all of that. I think an awful lot depends on the experiences that the children will have had. There are going to be some children that will have spent a lot of time playing video games, and they won't be used to the sorts of reward structures of the school, and they'll become even less regulated and find it more difficult to focus. And in those instances, I would think it's the same sorts of processes that are involved. So it's we need to bear in mind that the reward system responds to praise and novelty, rewards, acknowledging achievement, working in pairs, all the stuff mentioned in the engagement session, but they're going to need it a lot more, essentially, because they will have become, especially with a lot of video game playing things, they'll have got quite habituated to very rapid schedules of reward. On the other hand, we can't generalize, because there are going to be some children who actually will have become more regulated as a result of having to work on their own, and will have responded to that and risen to the challenge, and will actually find themselves more independent, more autonomous, less in need, really, of the scaffolding that teachers provide in order to learn. So some children will actually probably be requiring more autonomy, and actually will benefit from being allowed to be a little bit more independent in the classroom. So I think that the challenges for teachers there's going to be such a diverse range of the ways in which lockdown will have impacted.
It's certainly going to be an area we want to keep an eye on as well, and hopefully we can help respond to those needs too. Because I can only imagine what's been happening in schools over the last week, and the different approaches and the different ways that children have returned to school as well. I mean, some of them will have been perhaps isolated for quite some time, and coming back into a more social environment, that's going to be a huge change for them. But then even with the layout of classrooms, all the students facing forwards, teacher at the front, is very different to how a lot of classrooms operated before lockdown as well. So the whole environment is going to be very different for everyone, teachers as well. So there's a question from Willie, which is, what can I do when I notice that my students' learning motivation environment at home is no good at all? Now, Paul, I know we have some answer to this, because we provided some guidance during lockdown itself. So
yes, I mean, the only thing is, the guidance that we've provided, of course, is to parents. So I would say, very definitely, it would be great for parents to access the website that we've developed on the science of learning at home. And I'm sure, Matt, it's going to be possible for you to put up an address for that for people to reach, a link. But of course, this is actually from the perspective, I'm assuming, of a teacher. And it is quite difficult, really, because you can't lecture parents always on everything that they could do. We've tried to indicate a pretty wide range of things that they could do on that website, so definitely direct them to the website. But I think in terms of very simple, basic messages that you might be able to pass over to parents, I think having a structured having a structured evening where they get to bed at a certain time without playing video games immediately before they go to bed, and looking after their sleep is really, really important, as is having a quiet place and a quiet, time and a scheduled time for them to focus on their work, because the home environment has been very, very important for children's learning. I think it's going to continue to be so for some time. I mean, it always is, but I mean, it's going to continue to be so more than pre-pandemic, I think, for some time, because of the disruption that we're looking at.
Yeah. So I'd just add, I'm maybe coming at this from a slightly different point. Is I've done quite a bit of research and different projects looking at working with parents around supporting children's learning, and the kind of relationships schools have with parents really vary hugely. So in some schools, there's quite a bit of work to do sometimes in actually starting that relationship with parents and helping parents to feel welcome and engaged in what the school's doing. And that can be really important, because an awful lot of parents just don't know how important their role is for children's learning. In some of our research, we included some questions on a survey about whose responsibility children's education was. And an awful lot of parents, once children reached about 5 years old and started reception class, they had the idea in their minds that it's completely the school's responsibility now. And their job as parents, as educators, is pretty much done. And in those cases, there's definitely work to do for schools to make sure parents are kind of part of the school community and know that no matter what they think, they're really influential on their parents' learning. And they're still really the children's primary educator. That's where children are getting most of their ideas from, will be from their parents or carers. So schools having a strategy to develop that relationship with parents can be really helpful. And you might need to be creative, because there are some parents who really didn't have a good experience of school themselves. And they might be in families generally where there isn't a strong culture of education. But the schools we've worked with, sometimes have, found ways to deal with that, possibly by having initial meetings outside of the school building, because a lot of parents aren't that keen to come in at all. And so an initial meeting for children's parents in your class, maybe in primary school, might be best held outside of the school grounds, where it might be more informal and parents might be more relaxed. So sometimes you might need to be a little bit more creative just to start that relationship. But in our experience working with schools that have developed better relationships with parents, that can then set them up in a much better position to do the kinds of things that Paul was just saying, and let parents know that sleep is really important. And just having a conversation about the school day is really good, because it helps children, it helps reinforce that attitude that school is a good thing and parents are interested in what's going on in school. And a lot of parents aren't really aware that that's a useful thing. But it is worth putting that initial investment in to get the relationship started, because if you're not seeing parents, you can't get any of this started as a teacher.
Incredibly valid point there. That relationship is so important. Willie continues with another question. What can I do if I notice my students' prior knowledge is poor and when there's no prior knowledge at all? And obviously this relates to the processes that we talked about in the course. Tim, would you like to start off that one, please? Yeah,
so my response to this would be there is always some prior knowledge. Children nobody starts from a completely blank slate when they come into a classroom or any other kind of learning situation. And if children's prior knowledge isn't where it needs to be to learn from the tasks you've designed as a teacher, then it's the tasks that are wrong and not the children. And part of the business of what we need to be doing in education is figuring out where children are in their understanding and working from there, rather than trying to create a connection between children and a curriculum that might be too far ahead for them, or tasks that they're not ready to deal with yet. So if if that's the situation you're in, where students' prior knowledge isn't sufficient to deal with the work that you've got in mind for them, that's the work to do, is to find out, so what do they know, where are we starting from, and how can you design a sequence of learning experiences to go from where they are at the moment to where you want them to be. I think that's all I could say there. It would depend so much on the actual content to add any more there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim's said it all really. It's really important just to find out where the firm ground is and to build on that. And we spent a lot of time thinking about this engage, build, consolidate, and the right words to use for those different categories of learning processes. And the idea of build is completely central to teaching and learning. You can only build on what's there. You can only build on the secure knowledge that the child already has. And as Tim says, there's always something that they already know to build on, and you have to find out what that is, because otherwise, if it's not secure, then the building collapses essentially, because it's not meaningful, and without the meaning, that's like the glue that sticks everything together.
Thank you very much, Paul and Tim. And just to sort of signpost Willie to one of our other courses, we have a whole collection of courses which is about formative assessment. It's a way, and when I don't mean formative assessment here as test. I'm talking about using formative approaches in the classroom, where you will uncover what knowledge and experiences students already have that you can then build upon. So there are lots of techniques we have within those courses that you can use to identify that prior understanding, prior knowledge. Christine now has a question, and she's working in what seems to be quite a challenging environment, working with students who have had drug and alcohol issues along with mental health issues. Education within that context is mandatory for them, but they're not in a good place to learn. So how could she support learners to help them retain their learning when they have poor concentration levels and poor memories as well?
So I should say straight off that I'm not an expert in drug and alcohol and mental health issues, but my understanding is that some of the issues relate to difficulty in controlling attention. And I think some of the principles and concepts that we've talked about in terms of engagement for learning will still apply. So, those are really important to think about. But also, some of these issues can have an impact on working memory. So scaffolding working memory by showing you're working and using note taking and having guides that you can refer to, and visual guides, written notes and all the rest of it, all of that is going to be important. Some of these issues focus on, or at least are related to, anxiety. And so I think the other thing I would say is one of the most important issues in terms of approaching anxiety, as I understand it, is to make sure that you're in a secure environment, that you have trusting, safe relationships with the adults around you. And I know that's very difficult quite often, because finding the time to talk and to communicate and build these relationships is the most limited resource and the most valued resource that a teacher has. So I realize how difficult that can be sometimes, but feeling that you're in a safe environment can be really important if you're suffering these sorts of issues.
Yeah, so I agree with all of that. And again, like Paul, I'm not an expert in education for this kind of group of learners, drug and alcohol issues and other mental health issues. But I imagine there will be the challenge of finding out what kinds of content and what kinds of contexts are genuinely meaningful to the learners, and then building from there. I think this could be a kind of situation where that kind of thing, finding out where the learners are in their understandings and what they're motivated by already, rather than trying to start with a preset curriculum and motivate learners to follow that curriculum. It may be a situation where it's more about starting where the learners are and developing kind of learning activities that stem from their own kind of personal motivations, and building from there as a kind of place to start.
But there's also a really good guide. It might be helpful. There's a Understanding Working Memory, a classroom guide by Gathercole and Alloway, and it might be worth just making that available to Christine and others, or at least providing a link to it.
Thank you. Some really nice ideas there, and I think it is a very specialist area, but hopefully that will give you some inspiration anyway to start with. Our next question comes from Anne, and she's asking about multisensory learning. It's a question we get quite a lot on the Q&As, but it's a good question. In particular, this one is about the use of physical activity in learning, and there are examples about how we use the body to physically represent information, but there's a question of whether physical movement that doesn't necessarily relate to the subject matter, but is just a teaching means, shall we say, a teaching approach, whether that has the same impact. Tim, would you like to start with this question, please?
Yeah, I'm sure Paul will have some things to add here. I mean, my initial thought would be to be a bit careful with this kind of approach, because obviously adding in the physical activity does take more time out of the lesson, and if there isn't that connection between the activity and the meaning of the content that you're trying to get children to understand, there may not be that much direct learning benefit. And it's definitely possible that the physical activity could be a distraction from the learning rather than supporting it. Thinking about cognitive load and so on. If children are thinking more about the physical activity rather than the learning material, then that could be an issue. I think physical activity in general is good, but trying to manage that alongside actually learning and having a focus on material to be learned, I think there's potentially more harm than good, and it might be more effective to focus on one thing at a time. But I don't know. What do you think, Paul?
So I think it's an interesting question, because in a way this gets at the heart of what we've been trying to promote on the course, which is the importance of thinking about why or how a particular strategy works. Because some of the things that Anne suggests, such as a grammar game that requires you to move around to interact with different people, well, actually, if that's about generating different types of conversations because you're with different people and using grammar in different ways as a result of that, then that's going to be working well, because it's encouraging you to apply what you've learned in different ways. Actually, it hasn't got anything to do with moving around. I mean, you could be doing that on a phone without moving. So the moving around is kind of facilitating a different type of approach, which is working, but not because of the moving around. So, and once you realize that, then maybe you think, well, actually, it would be better to do this in a different way that didn't require so much movement. And again, the classification activity, if you're telling people to run to different corners of the room to classify things, so if it's this sort of thing, then go to that corner. If it's that sort of thing, then go to that corner. Actually, that could be working because you are enacting classification, but in an active way, but you're still enacting it, and that's why it's working. I mean, it might work just as well if you were putting the things in little boxes that are in front of you, so you could sort of cut down on the movement. So some of these strategies are actually quite good, but possibly not because of the movement. And once you realize that, and you think about why or how something's working, then you can probably do it more effectively. I mean, all of that said, we do know that exercise and movement can be really good for learning in a general way. But once you realize why, and it's because of that aerobic content of the movement and exercise, then you could probably do that better as well. So Brain Gym, for example, encourages people to do these sort of lazy 8s in the air. Well, that doesn't really help because it's not very aerobic. It doesn't get the cardiovascular system going. But if at the start of every lesson you had sort of 5 minutes of exercise running on the spot or something like that, that probably would help actually, because it gets the blood flowing. So so I've forgotten the question now. Should we be doing these? Yeah, I think if something's working, then do it, but try to understand why it's working. Try to use the concepts that you've encountered on the course to understand why and how it's working. And then chances are you're going to be able to do it even more effectively.
Thank you very much, Tim and Paul. We have a question now from Ines about consolidation of learning. And in particular, in the normal school environment where you might have anywhere between 3 and 6 subjects a day, how does that impact on the consolidation process, particularly when you've got so many different subjects?
So I think this is a really good question. And, we do have a school day that's set up like this. So I know, again, my son, I think, has 5 subjects in a day, and there's not a huge amount of time within each one. So a lesson might be an hour long, but after getting sat down and getting ready to learn, and with time to pack up and get ready to leave at the end, you may be looking at more like 45, 50 minutes on a subject. But I don't think this is just about consolidation. I think it's partly we know that the building phase takes time as well. And sometimes you may need, ideally, more than 40, 45 minutes to deal with a concept and think about a concept for enough time and from enough kind of different perspectives to gain that kind of depth of understanding that we might be looking for in a situation. And so I think for both building and consolidation, teachers really need to be thinking of lessons as individual sessions of 45, 50 minutes, however long they are, but also really thinking carefully about the sequencing of material across lessons, and being really aware of this fact that just because you've got to some kind of stage where you can perceive there's some learning there, or students have understood a concept in a particular way in one lesson, that's not over, and that may well need, or almost certainly will need, revisiting in subsequent lessons in order for both the building and the consolidation phases to really happen as you want to. So especially where there are concepts that are particularly challenging or are particularly kind of important, or where there's concepts that are cornerstones for areas of the curriculum, those are ones where you really need to plan to revisit, to remind students of those, come at them from different perspectives and angles across multiple lessons, and think of these, both the building and consolidation processes, as happening over days and weeks rather than over minutes. I think that would be my advice there.
Thank you very much, Tim. A very thorough answer there, and I think that really helps to think about the role of consolidation as a longer term process, and particularly with the curriculum design as well, and how perhaps not necessarily sticking rigidly to your lesson plans, for the whole term. You have to be a bit more responsive to see how things are going.
Yeah. And I think it can be useful to think about how your own learning works, because there's lots of things that I'm very aware of in my learning, where you don't just get a concept in one go and that's it. So and there's a couple of examples I can think of. So I'm interested in music as a hobby, and I know I first got taught about relationships between scales and chords and so on back when I was 13 or 14. But I'm still learning quite a lot about those relationships between different scales and different modes of scales, and how that relates to the way that music's written and how that supports playing now. And it's so the building and the consolidation phases go on long term. And if you think as a teacher there's a concept like that that's important, you need to make sure you keep revisiting it, so that students have that opportunity to move on from understanding something at a more surface or procedural level, and really get that deeper understanding of relationships and how that is applied in different ways in different situations.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Our next questions are on brain plasticity and the classroom culture for helping students become a bit more aware about the plasticity of their brain. There's a question, first of all, from Mary. As a teacher of pupils with special needs, she's interested to know how neuroplasticity can vary with respect to different brain impairments, and the impact of the teacher on that, but also about the role of stress in the classroom as well. Particularly, we've got pupils with high degrees of anxiety. In the course, we talk about a little bit of stress being quite useful, but then how do we balance against the needs of all the students in the class?
So there are multiple issues that are raised in this question from Mary. We'll start with brain plasticity and brain impairments. So in terms of the basic mechanisms of brain plasticity, these are not really affected at a sort of cellular level, as far as we know, in most of these developmental disorders. But what we do have, it is at a sort of slightly higher level, issues that are causing the brain to become wired differently to the students who we might describe as normal. So the plasticity actually expresses itself in different ways as a result of that. The learning occurs in different ways. So if you think about, for example, with autism, then the issues with social processing means that some circuits are essentially under functioning and they won't change so much. There won't be so much plasticity there, or they'll change in less helpful ways than they might do with somebody without autism. But quite often that means that the autistic child will be using compensatory strategies that are still involving learning. They're still taking advantage of the plasticity of their brain. For example, using rules, sometimes explicit rules that they're acquiring in order to cope with particular social situations, looking for particular types of expression, following lists or sequences of particular actions in particular contexts that have been identified with the help of a parent or teacher. And for example, dyslexics, they're going to rely possibly more on visual decoding than phonological decoding if they're having trouble with their phonological circuit. So the plasticity is not less, but it is different. That means that the normal sequence of events, or that you would have in your average classroom, those children are going to find more challenging, and therefore that different approaches are needed that take account of this different wiring in the brain. And that really emphasizes the sort of creativity, the importance of the sort of creativity that you often see in special needs teachers, where they try different approaches, and it's a little bit like an engineering approach, where if this is working, then they adjust it a little bit more, and that innovative attitude, actually, where they're monitoring the learning and they're making adjustments all the time, is really the right thing to do. But I think if it's informed with an understanding of how brains are diverse and how they differ, particularly in relation to these different diagnoses, then I think there's more of a chance that you'll reach an optimum strategy quicker, I think. So that's the first part. And there's the issue of stress. I don't know, should I move on to Tim for stress?
And I think just being aware of students' anxiety is a really good start, because that means you're in a position where you can start thinking about adjusting maybe how you design the classroom or design learning to take account of that. And I think some of what Mary goes on to say is really helpful there, is about trying to create a flow in the classroom so that there's a rhythm to what you're doing. That implies a kind of set of routines or habits in the classroom, so that expectations are really clear. People know what's coming next, because sometimes anxiety is that kind of fear not knowing what's going to happen, or a mismatch between your expectations and reality, and having that kind of safety in knowing what's coming and having clear routines and habits in the classroom can be supportive there. And I think Mary's right in saying that can help learning become its own reward. So having that fulfillment of routines that you're expecting to come along, and having that time to really concentrate and feel that you get that reward from mastery of the concepts and mastery of the learning. So I think that in itself is a really good approach. You know, Paul, do you have any other thoughts about stress and anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that actually, I'm not sure how much we know about this, but for some reason, I think we do find patterns rewarding and habits rewarding. Reason they actually require less mental resources for us to get through the day if we're following a pattern, because those patterns have become automatic. So when you have a particular routine devised, not just in terms of sequences of activities, but also where you're doing those sequences of activities and what to where you go, where you go for them in the classroom, if it's a primary school classroom, or what equipment you need. Those sorts of things I think are really important for generating that sense of flow. And what do we mean by flow? Well, I think it comes down, quite often we talk about it in terms of some intrinsic motivation, but from the studies I think that have been done, you can relate flow to that activation of the brain's reward system. So many of the things we've talked about are still relevant, but I think the idea of patterns, because they create that predictability, they are just very reassuring, and they can reduce some of the stress, the excess stress, the sort of stress you don't need, which is not actually related to the task itself, but just a sense of not really knowing, what to do next. And that sort of stress is not very helpful to learning. So I think patterns and routines really, really important.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Tim, for your responses to Mary. So Sarah has asked, are there any recommended videos or resources for teaching high school students about brain plasticity? Tim, I believe you found something that might be of interest.
Yeah. So the main one that I'm aware of, I don't have any direct experience of it myself, but it's based on Carol Dweck's work, and it's a program or a short course that's been evaluated in quite a large scale trial and was shown to be effective. So that can be found. It's an organization called PERTS, which stands for Project for Education Research That Scales, based in the US. So the web address there is perts.net. And one of their short courses is called Growth Mindset for Ninth Graders. So it's a course that teachers can use. So that's ninth grade in the US. I'm not sure exactly what that corresponds to, but I guess that lines up with Sarah's question about teaching high school students. So like I say, I've not seen the course or used it myself, but I know that is one that's been evaluated and been shown to be effective in improving learning. And not many things are shown to be effective at improving learning at scale. So that makes me think it'd be worth having a look at least.
Thank you, Tim. Our final question for today comes from Imad, and Imad is asking about the current situation where educators are being asked to design hybrid learning, the learning that takes place both online and in the face-to-face environment. Paul and Tim, I know you're both in the middle of doing exactly this work for your own students. Any ideas or suggestions that you could provide at this stage?
Well, I think one of the issues about hybrid types of learning is to make sure that the online and the physical classes are actually connected. I think that's quite a big issue, because one of the issues with online learning quite often is that it's not active enough. It can feel quite solitary, and it also can be difficult to monitor what the children are doing. Have they just gone off to make a cup of coffee or whatever? So I think that has to be taken account of when you have the physical or face-to-face sessions, So if the online tasks that are given, the online teaching can include activities that encourage the students to process the information, to rehearse it, to apply it in different ways. That's fantastic, but it needs to be seen, it needs to be rewarded, it needs to be shared, and therefore, one way of doing this is to make sure that when it comes to the face-to-face session, that those outcomes are then brought into that face-to-face session and discussed, evaluated, rewarded, so that everybody knows that this has happened. Because I think too often, the online teaching can involve just asking children or presenting information to children, sometimes just presenting information to children, but also presenting information and asking them to do questions or whatever. But those questions and tasks are not actually then ever referred to. So I think that's a really key issue.
Yeah, that I definitely agree that having that coherence between the online and face-to-face is really important, and making sure that any work you're asking learners to do is then valued and brought back in some way. I think school children and undergraduates and postgraduates tend to get a bit fed up if they're asked to do work that's never referred to again, and that can be really demoralizing. I think another thing to really think about is, how to align the different things you want to do in your teaching with the affordances of the different media. So I'm designing a module in statistics, an undergraduate module in statistics at the moment, in this way, where I'm not 100% sure at the moment which bits, how much I'm going to be allowed to do face-to-face, and how much is going to have to be remote, and how much is going to have to be allowing for both. But one of the things I'm doing is making sure that where I can have face-to-face teaching, I don't use that just for telling students things, because I know I can do that really effectively just by recording a 10 or 15-minute video for telling them that thing, and saving the face-to-face time for things that really benefit from being face-to-face. So having, if there's a need for any discussion, or possibly Q&A time after students have had a go at carrying out the task, or doing any kind of small group work, that's much easier for students to do face-to-face rather than remotely. Even though it can be possible to do remotely. But just that thinking of what are the different aspects of your teaching, and what are the different tasks you need to do as an instructor and you need your students to do, and which medium lends itself better to that, and trying to make the most of each of those.
Really excellent answers, Tim, Paul. Thank you very much. And just to let you know, there's two courses for both, one for primary, one for secondary teachers, where we've provided the courses that are designed for remote teaching, but of course in this new blended mode, then they equally apply. There's some useful templates on there to help you think about what the teacher is doing, what the student is doing, and which space that they should be doing those things in, that are available on those courses. So those links will be provided as well. And thank you very much for your responses. So that brings us to the end of the Q&A for the Science of Learning course for this run. Thank you once again to Professor Paul Howard-Jones and Professor Tim Jay for your expertise, and it's very much appreciated. Thank you, of course, to everyone who's posted a question, and we look forward to you joining us on future courses.